Hey everyone, thanks for the intro. I'm super excited to be here and meeting you all virtually. So let's start. I want to introduce myself. So my name is Andrew Carter. I work as a design system designer at Bumble. And since I was a kid, I was always fascinated by design. And after school, I wound up in design, working with several companies. And I worked my way through small agencies and I worked in my previous job. I worked at Revolut as a product designer, and now I work at Bumble. I joined about 6 months ago, and I am responsible to maintain the design systems for both our products, Bumble and Badoo. And if you haven't seen or used our products before, they look like this. So we have two main products, Bumble and Badoo. On the left, you can see Badoo, and on the right, you can see Bumble. And we develop the application for all the possible platforms, including iOS, Android, desktop, and mobile web. So basically, our mission is to offer the most equitable, inclusive, and empowering way to connect and to have users all around the world so one can expect to have ongoing updates to components and new features are added on a daily basis. So let's talk about design systems. So what I would like to talk to you about today is Figma components in sync with code components. My talk is broken down into several parts, and I'm going to cover lots of research. And I'm also going to show our approach to maintaining the design systems. My talk today is mainly going to be focused on how to use the design systems and not what it is. So as mentioned earlier, 6 months ago, I joined Bumble as a design systems designer, and my first task was to migrate the UI kit we had in Sketch to Figma. And this is the UI kit we had in Sketch. The problem with the design systems we had in Sketch was that one, it was only covering about 40 to 50% of our components we had in production. Components had inconsistencies in naming and spacing, and designers ended up detaching components to achieve the variant that they needed, which of course led to losing the single source of truth. So after going over all this, we had to define our goal. So at Bumble, being a small design team of 10 product designers, we need everyone to act like a leader in the area. We actively encourage everyone to push themselves and drive projects independently, while, of course, simultaneously collaborating with each other. While migrating to Figma, our main goal was to improve the collaboration between designers and developers. And we all know that Figma is an all-in-one design tool built for collaboration, and having a collaborative design tool which brings designers, engineers, and others on your journey is really helpful. But unfortunately, that doesn't automatically lead to better collaboration. So what we wanted to do is we wanted to make sure that all our files were organized and design components are in sync with code components. So how did we do it? We could have easily imported the sketch file in Figma, which is a great feature Figma offers. I used it a couple of times and it's amazing. But if we took this approach, we would have migrated to Figma with the same problems we had in Sketch, with the same inconsistencies in spacing, same inconsistencies in naming, and all the other problems we had in Sketch. So what we did is we took a different approach. We interviewed designers to understand user needs and problems, and we sat down together with developers to assess the state of the design systems. For these, we mainly use meetings and one-on-ones to interview designers and developers, and we ask them questions on usability of the design systems. What about the findings? So designers noted lack of components and documentation. Developers expressed inconsistencies in sizes between components, which of course caused a lot of confusion, and layer namings were not aligned with components we have in production. So after interviewing designers and developers, I decided to use Cosmos. So what is Cosmos? So Cosmos is our online design systems, which also ended up being the reference for me. Because as mentioned in Sketch, we only had about 40 to 50% of components we have in production. So we had a lot of inconsistencies there. So basically, Cosmos was the only source of truth for me. And also, the reason being is because in Cosmos, we have all the variants of each component, as you can see on the right side of the screen. And I also had reference to all the tokens for each component, as you can see on the left of the screen. I also had the spec sheet included for the components as well, as you can see at the bottom left of the screen. I also had reference to specific parameters, which are used to customize the component, which of course was and still is really helpful to me. And for those that are designing a brand new design systems, you might ask, what if we don't have Cosmos? So basically, we all know that Figma is an open design tool and accessible to everyone. So we can bring developers on board and we can have conversations with developers to go over the components together. So you don't have to have this complex system. Of course, it helps, but you can still do what I'm going to show you in a bit without having all the tokens and specs at hand. So after referring to Cosmos, I decided to start off with the most complex component. The reason why I wanted to start off with the most complex component is so that I would understand the limitations and complexities of each component, to understand the effort required, and of course, it gets even harder to do the tricky stuff later if we start with the simple components. So after doing some research, I discovered that the chat component is the most complex component. So our product is mainly based on bringing people together, chat, meet, and eventually fall in love. So the chat is a component that designers use often in their designs. And in this talk, I will be using the chat as an example, since it is one of the most complex components Bumble and Badoo have. But keep in mind that this can be applied to any other component you might have. For those that are not familiar with our products or never used them before, this is how the chat component looks like. On the left, you can see Badoo, and on the right, you can see Bumble. And from the screens here, you can see that there are a number of variants for the chat component. And believe it or not, in total, if we gather all the variants, we would end up with more than 450 variants. It seems like a simple component, but you heard that one right, more than 450 variants. So let's have a look. We all know that most of the chat messages are text-based, but there are other variants such as the media, the GIF, the text with link, the song, the gift message, the audio message, the emoji, sticker, and many more messages. But that's not just it. Each message can either be outgoing, it can also be incoming. Both are using different colors. Messages can be base. It can be continuous when you have two messages on top of each other. Each message can be a reply, but the reply can also apply to all other components, such as reply with a song, reply with an emoji, reply with an audio, and all the other messages. And since we have a reply, we have a forward as well. And this is a simple text message forwarded. But the same as the reply, the forward message also applies to all other components, such as forward media message, the song, the audio, and many more variants, which I haven't added here. So I was really confused at this point, as I had just joined the company. I never worked on such complex components before, and my task was to migrate to Figma and notice that we have all these variants which designers use most of them. And of course, I had a deadline to meet, and this is just for the chat components of the same thing, and the same complexities apply to all other components. And this was my reaction when I noticed the complexities of the chat component. So I was really confused and concerned at this point. So I sat down and I started to ask questions to myself. And these are some of the questions I asked. How can I create all these variants? Are we going to end up with more than 450 components? How can I maintain all these variants in Figma? And how I can possibly do it? So before we dig into how components are built in Figma and how we manage to sync them with code, one needs to understand how the chat component is built in code. So let me show you some code. Don't worry, designers, I'm not going to show you how to code. I'm just going to go over some very basic stuff here. As you can see here, this particular chat message, which we refer to as text with link, is built using three basic components. On the right, you can see the reference to the code, and on the left, you can see the actual component. On a side note, if you are not familiar with code or don't know code at all, you can have a conversation with developers, and developers will walk you through the components. For example, here are the logical grouping chunks for this particular component. So don't worry if you don't know code at all or don't know how to code, you can still do this. This is another example here. On the right, you can see the reference to the code, and on the left, you can see the actual component, which we refer to as gift. And you can see that it's built using two basic components. So after going over Cosmos and understanding the component in code, and before I actually started using Figma and building components, I started off with research. And for me, this was a really factor because it helped me understand the component from a different perspective. I went over all the types of messages and took note of everything, including the behavior and which components each type of message is using. I personally find that doing a thorough investigation of the component is very, very helpful to refer to, especially when building components in Figma. So, do you remember the components I showed you a few minutes ago, the text with link and the gift? So let's try to recreate them in Figma. How would you do it? From a design implementation point of view, the first thought and approach would be to have a main component for each variant. They look completely different, so it makes sense, no, to have a main component for each variant. So let's do that. So this is the gift component created as main component. And this is the component which we refer to as text with link created as main component. But what about the other variants? Do you remember that we have the incoming, the outgoing, the forward, the reply, the base, the continuous, and all the other variants? If we take the approach of creating a main component for each variant, we would end up with something like this, which of course we don't want. And you would notice that this is a bad approach. And the reason being is that if we take this approach, we would end up with hundreds of components and no single source of truth, which of course is very difficult to maintain. And when you have to update something and you have to go into each component, and considering we have hundreds of variants, updating them becomes a nightmare. So thanks to the code investigation we did, we now know that both components are built using the same main component, which is the complex content plus footer, as you can see in the Excel sheet here. So let's take a look at the chat component architecture. If we look at the chat component architecture here, we can see that all the chat message components are built using only 4 components. And this was discovered thanks to the research we did. So basically, these are all the types of messages we have in code, and these are the chat bubble simple, chat bubble complex content, chat bubble complex footer, and the chat bubble liquid. And each message has a purpose, as you can see in the diagram here. So let's see the construction of the 2 components I showed you in the previous slides. So this is the component which we refer to as the text with link. This is how it's built, and this is how it's related to code. And you can see that it's built using 3 basic components. This is the gift example, This is how it's built, and this is how it's related to code. And you can see that it's built using two basic components. So even though both messages are looking completely different from each other, you would notice that both components are using the same main components. So thanks to the code investigation, we can conclude that we can have a main component for the simple bubbles to avoid this mess. You remember? So now that we discovered how we did the research, it's time for the fun part. So let's dig into some technicalities of how the component is built in Figma. Do you remember the four basic core components we have in code? So what we did is we created all the components as main components in Figma. And this is the result. You would also notice that all these main components are for the incoming messages only. So what we did is we added the outgoing messages as main components as well. And the reason for this, the reason why we have two main components for the incoming and the outgoing message, is so that if we ever decide to change the background color for the outgoing message or for the incoming messages, the developer will change the value in the token, and the designers can easily change it from the main component and don't have to go into each variant. And this applies to all other specs and tokens in the main component, including the horizontal spacing, vertical spacing, colors, and even radiuses. But I will get to that in a minute. You would also notice that we are using placeholders. So what is a placeholder and why we are using them? So basically, a placeholder is an empty component instance intended to be swapped with other components. And the reason why we are using them is so that it makes the component design more scalable for future variants of content. So let's have a look at this example. We are going to build a basic forward text message. And you can see that we have two contents on the left and three placeholders on the right. So on the left, we have the forward and the actual message, and in the main component, we have three placeholders. So thanks to auto layout, if we have some extra placeholders, we can easily remove them, and the container will resize automatically, maintaining the same spacing and specs. So now if we actually replace the placeholders with the content, we would end up with this variant. And since we are following the same structure in code, now we know that we can create multiple variants using the same main component. So if we add more content, we can create more variants. And the single source of truth will always be this component only. And the beauty behind this is that if we ever decide to change the color or the spacing or the padding, etc. of the variants on the right, we will only apply the changes to the main component highlighted in the middle of the screen. You might also be asking, how are we achieving the direction of the message? You know that we have the base and the continuous. And the answer lies in spacers. So the way we're doing it is by using spacers, and spacers are used this way. So we have components for each spacer, and thanks to auto layout, we can hide or show the spacer that we need from the layer panel. And this treatment is also really helpful, as spacers act as a single source of truth for the radius, the same way we have a token in code. Now that I showed you some technicalities, let's see them in practice. So I'm going to rebuild this component using the new approach, which is the text forward message. Here you can see how easy it is to change the placeholder with the content. And thanks to auto layout, the component will resize automatically. And even if a designer wants to have a multi-line message, the component will resize automatically. When it comes to syncing code components with Figma components, since we are following the same architecture we have in code, we ended up with the same layer namings and structure we have in code. So on the left, you can see a screenshot from Figma of the layer panel, and on the right, you can see the reference to the code. And you can see that we are using the same namings and the same logical grouping. So how it ended up? We ended up with more variants than we planned to have in the UI kit. Here are some stills from the UI kit where designers are able to copy and paste them in their design files. These are some of the variants for the text with link, and these are the audio variants. Now, of course, you might not want to have all the variants in your library, but you know that it is supported if a designer requests it. Some of the components you are seeing here, thanks to the prototyping tool in Figma, are also animated. So the loader that you're seeing there and the actual GIF component, when a designer uses the prototyping feature in Figma, they can actually see the component animated. Now, what I just showed you here for the chat component, we basically did the same thing for all the other components we have in production. And since we started with the most complex, we reused the emerging patterns for the other components. So how did we do it? We started with the most complex component. I personally found it much easier to build other components when starting off with the most complex component. We reused emerging patterns, and we followed the hockey stick factor, which typically outlines that at first we hustle a lot, and then there will be a turning point, and the turning point is where we reused emerging patterns, and that's when there was no turning back. By the end of the migration, we were expected to deliver 28 components, but we actually managed to deliver 46. So to conclude, some takeaways. I believe that designers aren't just folks that draw boxes. We're thinkers. Lots of design doesn't even happen in a design tool. So I would suggest to spend a little bit more time to think than doing. Takeaway number 2, this goes hand in hand with the previous takeaway, analyzing the components and doing your research before you start designing is really, really helpful. As mentioned earlier, I started off with the most complex component to understand the limitations and complexities, and of course, understand the effort required. So make sure that you build a good structure in the beginning, as it will pay off later. I just love auto layout. I would highly recommend using it. If it wasn't for auto layout, we would not have been able to achieve what I just showed you. So use auto layout. It's a super powerful tool. And to close, collaborate with developers to have everything in sync as possible. Developers can be really helpful to us designers, and if it wasn't for the developers in my team, I would have never understood the architecture of the components. So collaborate with them so that we can create a great working relationship between us designers and engineers. So thank you, everyone. I hope you found this talk helpful. Unfortunately, we don't have time for any questions, so feel free to reach out. And I hope you implement something similar in your design systems. As a side note, we are always looking for people to join our team. Our design family is growing, so if you want to have more information, you can have a look at bumble.com/jobs. Thanks, everyone. Now I will pass back to Nico and Natalie in the London studio. Thanks, everyone.